Get ready.
Unfortunately, it's just not that great. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the channel. I'm the SSG, and this is the Twinsticks, Sega's answer to Mecha. While many areas in the West were beginning to see arcade returns diminish, the same couldn't be said for Japan. If anything, the arcade was very much alive and well there. Companies like Capcom, Namco, and of course Sega were steadily pushing out new cabinets, hungry to eat up tokens from gamers of all ages. And with such a flooded market, companies knew they had to have a way to stand out. One of the simplest ways to do that in the arcade was how you interact with the game. So what does a company do to stand out when things like steering wheels and light guns have been done to death? Well, in Japan, you slap on two joysticks and put the player in control of a mech. Hitting the arcades in '95, Sega's Virtuon cabs were an overnight success story, running on Sega's Model 2 arcade board with a pair of joysticks right out of Gundam. The game gave Mecha enthusiasts one of their first real instances of feeling like they were truly in the cockpit of one of these metal-clad behemoths. And in general Sega fashion, anything successful in the arcades was sure to make its way to the living room. But in the case of Virtuon, a simple port to Sega's 5th generation console wasn't going to be enough. Those controls, they had to come with it. Released more than a year after the arcade, Virtuon's Saturn port hit store shelves in December of '96. Of course, there was a standalone game, but the real product featured was the game packed in with the Twinstick. Sega spared no expense with this peripheral and ensured a quite sizable production run of units. In fact, it was quite common to see more of the box units than the individual games by themselves. And with a generous price point of 5,800 yen, or approximately 58 USD, most believe the units will be selling like hotcakes. However, even though the Saturn port of Virtuon was receiving a great deal of praise from fans and the press alike, the peripheral was hardly flying off of store shelves. In fact, sales were so bad that within the first few months, distributors had slashed prices by as much as 50%, and the price cuts wouldn't stop there. Eventually, some shops were selling units for as low as 500 yen or 5 USD respectively. And this may be in fact why you can still easily find very well maintained or even mint complete units for sale online, even after 22 years. Now you may be thinking to yourself, I've never even seen a Saturn Twinstick in Europe or the States, so what exactly happened? Well, sure enough, Sega never released the sticks outside of Japan, even though the arcade cabs were just as successful in North American and PAL territories. Stranger still is that the North American Saturn port of Virtuon does in fact support the sticks. Hell, the manual even describes the sticks and how to use them. Now I know a lot of people like to blame Sega of America for many of the Saturn's shortcomings, but Sega of Japan wasn't without fault by any means, and this was just another instance of them failing the broader Saturn community. With all that history aside, what are you actually getting with this little peripheral? Sporting two joysticks, the Twinstick gave players 8 points of digital input. Each joystick was mounted to a 4-point digital toggle switch that could allow up to 8 different movements. Both also utilize a single button on top as well as a single trigger. While these 4 inputs might not seem like much, when coupled with certain joystick movements they allowed for a myriad of options. The unit was also well weighted by way of a solid metal floor plate with 6 points of slip resistant padding. Your mileage may vary of course after 2 decades of use. And was officially supported by 4 titles, 3 of which were Japanese exclusives. Top it all off with a slick looking cover and a good old start button and you have any Mecha enthusiast's wet dream. Now if you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you probably already know that I have a deep appreciation for all things Saturn, and an even deeper love for all things Mecha. And you'd probably be thinking to yourself, I've had one of these units stashed away up in a corner just for this video. Unfortunately, that's just not the case. My actual journey with the Twinstick only began about 9 months ago. After releasing the first part of my Gungriffon retrospective, a fellow member of a Facebook group I belong to started asking me about part 2 and whether I would be covering the Twinsticks in it. After I informed him I had never used them, let alone even owned a unit, he insisted that I get one. Well, Bjorn, it only took me 8 months, but I finally got one. The first unit I ordered, that's right, the first one, arrived in near pristine condition. I was all geared up and ready to play some Virtuon when I noticed that my Saturn wasn't quite acting right. As soon as I booted up the console, it was as if I was constantly holding down an A on the controller. I tried it with all 4 games supported and even the US release of Virtuon, but it still kept acting like this. After a little inspection, I finally found the issue. The 5th pin on the controller port was completely detached, shoved up back into the port. What's even worse is that I came to realize that my Saturn was still receiving these ghost inputs regardless of what controller I used. Yeah. The Twinstick killed my controller port. So after I returned the defective unit, received my second Twinstick, and then performed surgery on 2 Saturns so that I could actually have a functioning console again, I finally got around to playing the games. And while I'd love to say that the experience eased the pain of losing a Saturn, I can only describe it as this: a lesson in frustration sprinkled with a few moments of joy, and the complete realization that 20 years of modern gaming had created a mental block that no matter what, I could not overcome. So with that little disclaimer out of the way, I suppose it's finally time to talk about using the Twinsticks. And first up, we got the flagship of this little peripheral, Virtuon. Now, being completely honest, I've always loved this game. Since the first time I sat down in one of its arcade cabs back in '98, I've always been fascinated by it. But no matter how many times I've tried, I've always sucked at it with the Saturn's controller. And in this instance, the Twinstick immediately changed the entire dynamic of the game for me. With a standard controller, it would take me days of grueling practice just to make it past the first boss and make my way to space. See, my main issue with the standard controller has always been trying to turn, and to keep up with my opponent, lock on or not, it always felt slow to react. In contrast, with the Twinstick, I was able to make it to space on my very first playthrough. Granted, I still suck at it. I was at least able to keep up with my opponents, and the sticks really made me feel like I had complete control over my Virtuoid. The simplistic button layout and little quirks like pushing the sticks apart to jump weren't the simplest to pick up on, but after a few hours of gameplay, I found myself really enjoying it. And considering that this is a third-person game, I never felt like I was moving too fast or losing my bearings, so in every respect I have to give the Twinsticks props in this instance. Not only did it make the game more fluid and easier, but it also complements the style of gameplay tremendously. This was unfortunately the last time I'd really find myself enjoying using this little peripheral, however. See, it's at this point that we leave the world of third-person arcade ports and enter the world of first-person. Making their Saturn debut exclusively in Japan, the later 2 games of the Gundam Blue Destiny trilogy placed you in the mech's cockpit from a first-person perspective. Now, I've never had any issue utilizing the standard 2D pad for any of these games. If anything, I believe they have some of the most sensible controls for a first-person game on the console, at least when coupled with the game's lock-on feature. So going in, I didn't really feel like the Twinsticks would drastically change or improve anything. And while the sticks didn't really hurt the playability of the game, it did make things feel more sluggish. For instance, instead of simply utilizing the shoulder buttons to turn, now I had to move the sticks counter to each other. One of the most conflicting experiences I had was boosting. It was vastly easier to start a boost and keep it going while using the sticks, but trying to change direction fluidly was near impossible. Couple all of this with Virtuon style jumping, and using the sticks really made playing the game more of a chore than anything else. For a game that already had a pretty simple control scheme that actually flows quite nicely with its inherent speed, the Twinstick eventually felt more like a slapped-on gimmick than a definitive way to play the game. And if I'm being completely honest, it's just a cumbersome way to play in general. Now for the whole reason I started down this path, and the game that I was most enthusiastic to try out with the sticks: Gungriffon 2. This is the follow-up to one of, if not my most beloved games on the console, and since I'll be covering it in detail pretty soon, I'll spare you the in-depth analysis for the moment. But one thing that does need to be said is that the Gungriffon games are by no means arcade games. The best way to describe them would be first-person mech sims. Their controls are cumbersome to learn and even harder to master with a standard 2D pad. Even worse, no matter how hard I've tried to tweak things, the button layout on a 3D pad seems locked in this weird setup that is completely contrary to the standard loadout. But for aiming, there is absolutely no rival to that of the analog stick. See, neither Gungriffon 1 or 2 have a lock-on feature like the previous 2 Gundam games. You have to manually aim and track your targets at all times. The only real exception to that being your anti-tank missiles, and even then you still have to track the enemy until you finally fire. If you remember back to whenever I was given the lowdown on the controller, I mentioned that it gave you 8 points of digital input. For Gungriffon 2, that means that your vertical and horizontal aiming is locked at this ridiculous speed, a speed that I could personally never get the hang of. Yes, the standard controller does the same, but with it you still feel like you have a measure of control over the momentum of your movements. With the sticks, it's either full throttle or absolutely nothing. Now you'd think that the dual stick configuration would lend itself pretty well to first-person gameplay, but this was just another instance of frustration. The left stick controls all of your movements, and instead of changing things to something akin to what most would consider a modern FPS loadout, it simply fixes the X and A button to your forward and backward movements. Tap once to walk and tap twice to activate your dash. It's simple but at the same time frustrating, mainly due to my tendency to try to utilize both sticks simultaneously, something I'll touch back on later. Then there's the game's slide mechanic, strafing in modern terminology. See, Gungriffon doesn't allow you to aim and strafe at the same time, and the addition of the sticks doesn't change that. but because it's locked to the side-to-side motion of the left stick, it becomes instinctual to try to strafe while you aim. This in turn leads to even more frustration as I fight to keep my reticle on target. Again, it's not that the sticks make the game unplayable, but that it doesn't really add anything to it either. As a result, it just makes the experience less fun and more work. Now I'm sure many of you have already realized what personally took me 2 weeks of head slamming frustration to. As I was going through this little journey, it finally dawned on me. I was looking at this peripheral through the eyes of someone who's used dual analog sticks for more than 20 years. More specifically, through the eyes of someone who has spent a good majority of that time playing first-person games. My brain had been hardwired and my muscle memory honed to the common layout that we all know today, and that's exactly what I expected to get. A device that would give my trusty old Saturn the dual analog support it always deserved, and more importantly, give me the ability to play these first-person mech games with a somewhat modern interface. But the thing is that the Twinsticks were never meant to be a substitute for dual analog control. It wasn't intended for first-person games like the PlayStation analog joystick. It's 2 joysticks coupled to 8 digital switches, and it was always meant for Virtual On. And in that respect, I absolutely love it. Using the sticks finally gave me the ability to fully enjoy a game I had loved for so long, but it had been absolute shit with thanks to my ineptitude with a standard controller. But even after I made this realization, it went back for another week, trying to give the other 3 games just one more chance. Doing everything in my power to take myself out of 2019 and go back to 97. I still found that I just couldn't break the muscle memory. And really, I had no reason to. I've been playing these games for 15 years, and I've never had a single issue or complaint with the standard pad. See, I'm not trying to paint the Twinstick as a bad peripheral. Rather, I'm trying to stress the fact that I know I won't be the only one to face this hurdle. Gaming has drastically changed since the 5th generation, and how we interact with games has changed even more so. For some of you, adapting to this old control scheme and its many quirks may be as easy as jumping back on a bike. But you may also find yourself fighting every impulse that your mind sends to your hands, just like I did. I suppose the only way to know for sure would be to actually pick up a set. Thankfully, the Twinstick can be found for sub $100 complete, and even less than that for the controller by itself. So will I be keeping mine? Well, yeah. For Virtual On alone, it was well worth the price. And hell, maybe I can eventually come to enjoy the other games with it. I'm not betting on it, but I'm always willing to give it another try. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you actually own a set, what your experience has been with it so far? Did you face some of the same hurdles I did, or was it as easy as jumping back on a bike? But as always, this is the SSG, and this is me, signing out.